Hey, good afternoon. Just about 1 minute after noon. Sorry, we're a few minutes late. I'm technologically challenged here. We've been doing so many Zoom webinars and it was hard to find the right link, but I do feel that this is an incredibly important webinar. If there's anything that we've learned from this pandemic, it is to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And in that spirit, Dr. Michael McCoskey, who is an incredibly accomplished and phenomenal natural resource for the United States and for the state of Israel, had written an op-ed that I read in the Jerusalem Post a while back, talking about how there should be a very narrowly defined defense treaty between the United States and Israel in the event of some horrific event from Iran or Hezbollah. Now, at first, I wasn't convinced and felt that one of the beautiful things about Israel is that it always has as a regnant part of its military philosophy that it defends itself only by itself. And I can make a lot of arguments for that. And then after Mike McCoskey from JINSA had spoken to Senator Lindsey Graham and planted the idea in his head, Senator Graham announced at EMET's Last Rays of Light in the Darkness dinner in last June, that he feels that this is a very good idea, and he got an incredibly warm reception. And still having had some doubts about it, I wanted to know what the government of Israel felt about it, so I made an appointment together with our Director of Israel's National Security Affairs, Benjamin Weil, to speak to Ambassador Ron Dermer, because there's nobody better than the ambassador from Israel to the United States to speak about this. And he was convinced. So before I introduce you to Michael McCoskey to take the mic, I want you to know what a real gem he is and a national treasure. He is the president and CEO of JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, which is a phenomenal organization. He is a U.S. national security expert and has worked extensively on American policy vis-a-vis Iran's nuclear program, Israel, and the broader Middle East, as well as on international energy markets. From 2006 to 2006, Mike was the Foreign Policy Director for the Bipartisan Policy Center, and before that, he served as Special Assistant in the Office of Secretary of Defense and was Director of Essential Services in the Washington office for the Coalition Provisional Authority, the post-war allied entity that governed Iraq. Michael has written articles, op-eds, and editorials on U.S. national security issues, primarily involving the Middle East, as well as the field of energy relating to Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Israel, and Yemen for a multitude of publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Weekly Standard, and the New Republic. He's been interviewed on CNBC, CNN, Fox, NPR, Voice of America Persian, and other media. And he's the author of a wonderful book that I really enjoyed reading, Michael, Churchill's Promised Land, that was put out by Yale University Press. Michael has a PhD in diplomatic history from Harvard, an MBA in finance from Columbia Business School, and a BA in history from the University of Chicago. So when discussing such a weighty issue, we cannot be in better hands. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for having me and for the very nice introduction. And it was nice seeing a couple minutes ago your terrific husband, Buddy, off on camera. So thank you very much, and appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and your supporters.
So why do you feel this is necessary?
Okay, so first of all, I'm really glad to see that you and EMET are, very supportive of this effort. I would say the foreign policy establishment, if there is such a thing, or the national security establishment, is really not picked this up. And this has nothing to do with whether you're pro-Israel or anti-Israel. A lot of pro-Israel people are just here in the United States are not supportive, and you have people in Israel and the security establishment that are skeptical. But we could get to that if you're interested. What drove us here at JINSA to pursue this was a couple of years ago. Um, the way we looked at when President Trump came into office, we saw a president who was very supportive of Israel, was going to be very tough on Iran, but was going to be very reluctant to support. It was going to be very reluctant to want to commit U.S. forces on the ground. That's how we saw things in 2017. So we put together a task force of retired U.S. generals and admirals, chaired by Admiral Jim Stavridis, former NATO commander. And we thought, in such a strategic environment, it was important for U.S. national security to bolster the bilateral U.S.-Israel security relationship. One of the recommendations that we put out, actually in 2018, was this idea of a U.S.-Israel mutual defense pact. This was actually Admiral Stavridis' idea, and then it was not a new idea, but it hadn't really been discussed for a long time. And what we did is we started researching this idea. First I say we put out the idea, and the Israeli government came to us and said, well, actually, we're really interested in that. And I said, well, that's interesting, because a number of the security folks in Israel we found were actually not. But then we came to learn that actually Prime Minister Netanyahu very much was, and obviously Ambassador Ron Dermer. We explored this issue, and we saw that America has mutual defense pacts with about 50 other countries. It's not, and in each case where that is, and that includes NATO, by the way, and Japan and Philippines and so on. And we saw that when countries have those mutual defense pacts with us, they are usually sources for stability in the world. Now, most Americans would probably think that Israel has a mutual defense pact with the United States, given how close the relationship was. But we don't, actually, and part of it is because Israel hasn't wanted it. Now, to answer your question, I'm sorry, with all that background, why do you need it now? Because what we see is as you point out, a rising Iranian threat that could threaten Israel's existence, that is the biggest threat to U.S. national security interests in the Middle East, and one of the most important threats that the United States faces worldwide. So we thought a mutual defense pact would be a source for stability in the Middle East, would be good for U.S. interests, would add a layer of deterrence to Israel, could help be a source of mitigation if there was a global conflict. If there was a major conflict in the region, it might mitigate the severity or intensity and scope of such a conflict. And we also thought it could be a platform for closer bilateral relations between the two countries. Now, I'll stop in this right now, but I'll say what you said at the beginning is absolutely correct. We envision a narrow mutual defense pact. For instance, if missiles were launched on London, God forbid, that would be a major event. It could trigger a mutual defense pact that we have our pact with England. Unfortunately, Israel faces this every day, almost from Gaza and else. So that's not the kind of scenario we're looking at. We're talking about major exceptional threats that threaten Israel's viability and existence. I'll stop.
Right. Okay. So what do you say to the argument that it's always been a regnant part of Israel's military strategy or philosophy that they defend themselves by themselves? Will this involve the potential sacrifice of American lives?
Right. So mutual defense pacts are firstly generally broadly written, and we drafted one that we put out. And Senator Graham spoke at your dinner in June
Right.
June last year, excuse me. we honored him at our dinner, Jensen's dinner in November. And as he pointed out, we wrote a draft. He gave us some edits, but generally they are broadly written, which give a lot of scope for each party about what they'll do. We don't specify. By the way, we're not saying what we wrote is the final draft. We want it to be like the first draft to help things move things along. But we don't envision a final mutual defense pact really specifying everything each country could do for the other. By the way, the things that Israel would do for the United States. Excuse me. The issue of Israel defending itself by itself is ingrained in Israel's DNA. That is one of the reasons why Israelis historically have been very skeptical, especially the military guys, because it's on their shoulders to actually defend Israel by itself. Now, there's another reason why, by the way, Israel has also been skeptical, or security folks tend to be. They're worried about anything that constrains their freedom of action.
Yes.
A third objection on the Israeli side, historically, particularly I would say on the political right, is they don't want it tied to concessions on the peace process. Israelis don't want to say, an American, let's say, president say, well, you don't really need to control the Jordan Valley because you got this mutual defense back and we have your back. So this gets to your question. The point is first of all, you never want it to get to that case. It adds a layer of deterrence because an enemy, such let's say a nuclear armed Iran, has to think twice about a serious attack on Israel because they don't know what the United States would be. Israel doesn't want U.S. forces to die on its soil. No American president wants American soldiers to die anywhere unnecessarily, obviously. That said, it doesn't really specify what America would do. It's possible that U.S. forces could be involved. It doesn't necessarily, we're not envisioning a tripwire like, we've had in Germany over the decades since the Cold War began. That's not what we envision, at least.
Right.
There'd be a lot of ways for the United States to help, but it's really up to both parties to decide what they would do in such a case.
Do you foresee this as, first of all, potentially opening up the door to tremendous amounts of anti-Semitism if, God forbid, as I said, with this pandemic, we have to confront the worst. And if, God forbid, there was a potential attack from Iran and American troops had to be called. One of the reasons this military strategy has worked so well is, we've never wanted a Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or anybody else to take a bullet to die for the Jewish state, and that's prevented a lot of anti-Semitism. Do you envision, I see a lot of parallels of, between World War I and World War II, where there was this period of isolationism and there was a tremendous amount of resistance to going overseas and fighting against the Nazis, and then you're saying we're fighting the Jewish war. Do you see parallels here?
Well, by the way, we see this from U.S. perspective as actually good in terms of, if it adds a layer of deterrence and a layer of stability to the region, we think it would mean the commitment of less U.S. forces to the region, just like it is in other parts of the world. So everybody knows that Israel does not want foreign forces to die on their soil. That would go, as we said, against Israel's very DNA. Every Israeli feels that viscerally. That said, we think a mutual defense pact, by adding a layer of deterrence, would mean meaning in a perverse sort of way, could mean less commitment of U.S. forces, because we think it's a source of stability, not of instability. What the worst thing I think it is for U.S. interest, and what could endanger U.S. forces more going forward, is actually more instability and embolden Iran and other extremist forces in the region. And what they also fear is a U.S. that is more detached from the region. We think the trend in U.S. commitments abroad is that there's going to be retrenchment of U.S. forces. I don't think it's just President Trump. You had President Obama before that, or whoever, whether it's President Trump again, if he gets reelected, or if it's President Biden, the trend in U.S. deployments is really not more, it's less.
Mm-hmm.
So that generally, I think generally is an incentive for extremists or bad forces to do
Mm-hmm.
more bad things. We think mutual defense pact actually could be a way to add more stability to the region, especially as U.S. forces withdraw. We have the ability to deploy forces very quickly if we need to. So I think if, as we're retrenching a bit, a mutual defense pact actually would help bolster stability in the region, and therefore meaning would be less a danger for U.S. forces. Now, in extreme exceptional circumstances, U.S. forces might need to be deployed, but again, in such a mutual defense pact, it doesn't commit American forces to do anything, at
Mm-hmm.
least the way we envision it. You could do a
Right.
lot of things. It could mean help. It could relate to intel. It could relate to resupply of weapons. Just
Mm-hmm.
the fact that you have a mutual defense pact could bolster that bilateral relationship and lead to even greater military cooperation, maybe more prepositioning
Yeah.
of weapons in the region. Just the fact of it could lead to other things that could strengthen Israel's ability, I think, to respond to exceptional
Right.
circumstances. But again, the key thing is that it adds a layer of deterrence.
Right. Right. Um, as you look around the Middle East, you see the map, and what do you feel are the greatest threats right now? I think we both know the answer, but I'd love for you to articulate it.
Around the world,
Around the world and around the Middle East in particular.
well, around the Middle East, of course, it's Iran, and then I guess it's more Iran, and then I think the Muslim Brotherhood, and I worry very much about Erdogan and Turkey,
Right.
but not just Turkey, but other, I worry about the Muslim Brotherhood and other radical Sunni forces. But I think the radical Shia forces are the most dangerous now
Right. Right.
because of the Iran's nuclear program.
Yeah.
And now, of course, they've been weakened because of this by their utter incompetence and disregard for their own population. Um, but look how they're reacting, even while they have thousands of people who are infected and people dying in Iran, is that they're still attacking U.S. forces in Iraq, or their proxies are, and how they've attacking Riyadh, or their proxies are. So coronavirus doesn't seem to be leading to Iranian
Right.
retrenchment. If anything, it might. I think our central commander, General McKenzie, just said, I think it was last week or so, that actually he sees that Iran could be more dangerous now, and that's
Right.
generally my view.
Right. Right. Another objection that I've heard is that we don't really need it. We already have such a high level of tacit cooperation between both militaries and intelligence and defense cooperation. How would you answer that objection?
It's yes and no. I know a lot of people say that, and they mean that in good faith. Um, First of all, we shouldn't always look at today as what's going to be tomorrow. While the impetus of our efforts starting in 2018 on a mutual defense pact was about mostly the Iranian threat. Um, what I see since then on the domestic side here in the United States is also concerning, because unfortunately you see a trend, particularly on the left, and I don't mean this in a partisan statement, and I don't even mean this about Biden, who I think is definitely pro-Israel, but you see in the Democratic Party, uh, much greater criticism of Israel, and a lack of sympathy towards Israel. Obviously, Bernie Sanders, and you see the people around him. The fact that the Democratic Party couldn't even condemn Omar's anti-Semitic statements, but had to broaden it. I think it now, even though Biden looks like he's going to lock up the nomination, though that hasn't been official yet, you see definitely real concerns here, I think, domestically on Israel's standing on the left. Now that we hope will change, of course, because it was for many decades, it was the Democratic Party that seemed more pro-Israel than the Republican Party. But unfortunately, that is not the case in the Democratic Party. So I think it'd be good, while you still have a generally very good bipartisan consensus on Israel, not what it was, but given where the trend lines are on the left,
Right.
I think it'd be good to kind of cement our relationship with Israel, and I think that'd be help ensure a stronger bilateral relationship.
Right. Now, how would this mitigate against a commander-in-chief who might not ultimately be sympathetic? I mean, doesn't the president ultimately call the shots in terms of commitment to defense?
Absolutely. Well, yes. So, look, we think that if you have a hostile president, a U.S. president hostile to Israel, uh, we think a treaty. And by the way, we're talking about the treaty, gain bipartisan support that would have to be voted on by 67 senators out of 100. So we're not talking about like an MOU here. We're talking about something that a treaty has a lot more gravitas and has a lot more weight. So I think a treaty actually could help mitigate the, let's say, lack of friendliness or even hostility by U.S. President to Israel. We think it could mitigate it. It certainly, I think, would not be a bad thing. So if you do have such a president, but we did see presidents have a lot of sway in foreign policy, but we think a treaty could maybe help limit, if there was, when we hope there isn't, but a president that will come to power who would be hostile to Israel.
Right, right. And we would just have a narrow window, you know, coronavirus or not, but, you know, with elections being held in November and, you know, we might just have until, you know, next December, because then everything happens, you know, people get off for Christmas and then there might possibly be a new president. It might possibly be a Democratic administration, which, as you said, the trend lines are just not that favorable. Although, you know, Joe Biden is certainly not radical. He's not a Bernie Sanders, but still he sees and feels the trend lines within his own party. And all those years of working under President Obama, negotiating the Iranian deal, JCPOA, he might be a little soft on Iran, I think. So, yeah. So
yeah, by the way, look, he said he would re-enter it. Actually, he'd want to re-enter JCPOA, which I think would be a big mistake. You know, we're not a partisan organization.
Right.
And I don't mean this in a partisan way,
Nor
but
we.
right, unfortunately, at least when the Democratic Party, aside from Bernie Sanders, who certainly, you know, was in his upper 70s, a lot of the Democratic leadership, you know, are I think very positive towards Israel. But again, it's the younger folks in the party and the more radical, but the more progressive side that seems to have really the energy in that party, not the more senior leadership that is the concern. I'm not really worried about the senior leadership of the Democratic Party, and I include Biden in that. It's the Omars, it's the AOCs, it's all those. Those are the concerns.
And I think you're very right about the trend lines, and you're right about how much power they seem to have within. I see that on Capitol Hill a lot in terms of trying to get legislation passed. So it's been a really difficult period over the last several months. Now I want to introduce the audience, if they don't know yet, are to Sarah Leah Thompson, who is our incredibly capable Director of Communications and General Office Manager and very talented woman who will read some of the questions that have come in.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, some of the questions we've received are, what can we as citizens do to support this?
Okay, that's a good question. Though we haven't focused on this yet, because first you'd have to have the Trump administration say they want to pursue a mutual defense pact, but you could first of all write the White House and demonstrate your support and communicate that, or write or communicate, call, whatever, speak directly to folks in the White House. That's, I think, the first priority. I'd say the second priority is to talk to your senators. this is, while it'd be good to get members of the House of Representatives supportive, ultimately it's going to come down to the Senate, because that's where a treaty would be done. And it'd be good to, if we're going to need 67 senators to get this passed. So I'm hoping, now you have Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump that have already discussed this. They've tweeted about it. Certainly Prime Minister Netanyahu, who it looks like is going to stay Prime Minister for at least another 18 months if this unity government actually holds. He is clearly championing this. President Trump seemed to have expressed a lot of sympathy towards it. If the administration says this is something that they want to do and they work out things between the government, then the focus will be on the Senate. So I'd say contact your senators.
Great. Have other questions come in?
Yes, they have. Our next question: the deterrent value against Iran and Hezbollah would be enormously valuable, but is it worth the political fight in the Senate, given the increasing anti-Israel sentiment in much of the Democratic Party?
Well, I'm sure maybe Sarah might have better insight into this than I do, but I know that Senator Graham, who's the big champion in the Senate on this, when I've asked him, and I'll defer to him as a vote counter, he feels very confident that the Senate would support it. Basically, if you have 67 senators, if the Trump administration supports it, let's say you lose one senator like a Rand Paul or something, about 52 Republicans, you would need at least 15 Democrats. Ideally, you'd want to get overwhelming bipartisan support. But I don't know, Lindsey Graham feels confident, so I'll just defer to Lindsey Graham.
Right. That's why I feel there's a very narrow window. While the Republicans control the Senate, which might not happen, after January of 2021.
Yeah.
So,
Sarah, as you know, when it comes to policy, things could take a long time. The Congress overwhelmingly, I think, voted on moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, I think in '95. It wasn't until a couple of years ago, in 2000, that the U.S. actually did it. There are other things that I know both organizations have been keen on designating as Iran's IRGC as a terrorist organization. That idea had been around for years. Actually, in a short time, we put out this idea in 2018. We started circulating the paper then. We put out official paper in 2019. In a short time, we've actually got both leaders' attention on it. I agree with you, Sarah, that 2020 would be the best year. Obviously, coronavirus has kind of slowed that momentum. We're all focused, obviously, understandably. We're all at home. We're doing a Zoom video. We got this is the immediate concern for our country and every other country. But I've actually been rather encouraged how quickly this idea has risen to the top of the bilateral discussion. So we'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll
Sarah Leah? Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, next question. I'm sorry. Did you want to go on? I'm sorry.
No. That's it.
Okay, Sarah Leah. Right.
Yes. Next question. If this pact is to tackle high-level threats, wouldn't the U.S. come for Israel's help right now, even if there weren't a pact?
Right now, yes. Maybe at what time with one weapons? I'll just remind folks in 2014, in the last, the mass war that Israel fought against Hamas in Gaza, Operation Protective Edge, the Obama administration actually withheld giving Israel Hellfire missiles that they wanted. They delayed it. I don't think the Israelis have forgotten that, by the way. I think given President Trump, if he's still president, given his record the last few years, I feel pretty comfortable that he'll come to Israel's aid, but we don't know who's going to be president after that. You don't know what other concerns President Trump or President Biden might have next year or the year after. The value of a mutual defense pact also is not just the treaty, but it's the work between the two governments to prepare scenarios and get things in place. So if it does need to implement it, then things could move a lot more quickly, and there's an immediate understanding of what needs to be done. So I think it'd be much better to have a mutual defense pact.
Next question.
Yes, our next question. How would this pact address emerging threats stemming from technological developments such as laser, 5G, AI, cyber, and others?
Good questions. This would be something for the two governments. We laid out some exceptional circumstances. Our basic principle is this, and a mutual defense pact, while it's mutual, it's understandable, like almost every other mutual defense pact that the United States has with 50 other countries, that it's more about how the United States would help the other country, although it also means how the other country could help us. Don't forget, like after 9/11, actually, Article 5 was invoked with NATO, and it was because when we were attacked that it was invoked. So it's about when Israel, generally our focus is here about when Israel's viability, its economic viability, its very survival is at stake. So however you define that, whether it's a cyber attack or things like that, that might trigger it, but it would have to be very exceptional sort of threat.
Sarle?
Okay, thank you. Another question. In this pact, what is Israel's requirement to help the U.S.? For example, could Israel be asked to provide soldiers if the U.S. was attacked by Saudi Arabians, such as 9/11, and then be criticized if they don't agree to provide soldiers?
Right. So every mutual defense pact is a little different. You have with our partners in Asia, where first of all it's designated what region of the world this relates to. So you don't have, wouldn't necessarily be invoked if Japanese soldiers wouldn't have to fight, let's say in Guam or something like that. You could define the boundaries, by the way. That's for the two parties. If in the case of Saudi Arabia, in that case, of course, it wasn't really the government that attacked the United States. It was individuals. We didn't go into Saudi Arabia to retaliate. We went into Afghanistan. But there'd be a lot of things that Israel could do, and we don't minimize that in any way. Intelligence sharing would be one. You might say, well, doesn't Israel give everything to the United States that they need? Actually, that's not even the case, and it's not because Israel doesn't want to. There aren't sufficient intelligence relationships between the two countries that even permit Israel to share everything with the United States. So we think actually a mutual defense pact might actually facilitate all sorts of cooperation that you don't have right now.
Sarle?
Thank you. Another question. Would each action of support under this treaty have to go through an approval process in the U.S. Congress? If so, given the Democratic Party's anti-Israel trend as well as Congress's slow pace of reaction, would the treaty actually hinder a quick response by Israel that may be needed? Or if Congress refuses to support, could it be seen as an actual lack of support?
If you had the two governments agree on this and then it failed in the Senate, that would certainly not be a good thing. As I said earlier, and we're talking about the Senate here because all treaties have to get approved by the Senate, 2/3 majority, so 67 senators. In our view, as I said before, I'll defer to Senator Lindsey Graham, who your organization honored and we honored last year at GINSA. He feels very confident about it. I think Senator Schumer, for instance, would certainly support it. That is my understanding that he would. I can't speak for him. He hasn't publicly said anything about it, but that is my understanding. I think you'd have a number of Democrats right now who'd be very supportive. What would be in the Senate next year? I have no idea, since I don't know who's going to win any election yet. So.
Right. Right. I think I should also point out the benefits to the United States and in terms of the incredible technological advantage Israel has on intelligence being right there in the Middle East, that they could enhance their intelligence sharing. So this isn't just a one-way street. And I think what Michael is talking about is not where America micromanages any wars or asks Israel to go if,
Afghanistan.
America decided to attack North Korea. They would not expect, this would be very narrowly defined. So I think it should be really spelled out that this is just for exceptional purposes, specifically with the looming threat of a nuclear Iran and Hezbollah, right?
Yeah, look, and as I said, I think this could be a platform for greater cooperation. Actually, Israel's status is not the same as one might expect. Their formal status is not as a non-NATO major ally. That is their status, actually. They don't have what are called Five Eyes type of relationship with Israel. They do not have, and with America, they don't have the same intelligence sharing arrangements that we have with Australia or the UK. We actually think that would be important. We think a mutual defense pact could actually be a platform for advancing those kind of things. So actually,
Right.
Israel will even have the ability to share more, and also the United States would be able to share more with Israel. So we see this as a very good platform for greater cooperation, even on a day-to-day basis.
Right. Next question, Sarah.
Yes, we have one or two more questions left. How do we refer to this treaty in letters to senators, and is there a proposed text available?
Yes, there is a text available. If you don't mind my saying this, Sarah, you can go to jinsa.org. On our website, we have drafted, it's a very short treaty. It's like 2.5 pages. We put it out last year as a way to kind of advance the discussion so people see what it is and what it's not. And we see it hopefully as a basis for the two countries to work on. Prime Minister Netanyahu has actually cited our treaty as a draft that he seems interested in, that he sees it's a very good basis for future discussion. So go to jinsa.org.
That's wonderful. Look, we're all about working together and collaborating, cooperating for the same goals. We all have the same objective, and that's the enhanced security of the United States and the enhanced security of the State of Israel. So yes, go ahead, Sarah.
The last question we have for now, do we have a plan to fight back against the pushback by professors?
Professors.
I'll let you, Sarah.
Well, academia is something that I've been working on for a very long time, and as everyone is well aware, there is an almost knee-jerk kind of antipathy among many departments, especially Middle Eastern Studies departments, against the State of Israel. I'm not sure if this is something that could be covered, on this discussion because it is so involved, but it's critical in terms of the impact that professors have on the hearts and minds of future generations. And I think, it's no coincidence that many of the people on at least one side of the aisle who have recently graduated from universities have almost this, reflexive anti-Israel sentiment. So it's something I think that we're going to have to hold for a later discussion. It's huge. I've spent a lot of time working on the issue of Title VI of the Higher Education Act, which gives grants to American universities for Middle Eastern Studies programs. And the original legislative intent in that, way back during the Cold War, when it was labeled then the National American Defense Education Act, was for Americans' defense, but it's been turned on its head, and it's become this kind of post-colonial, anti-American, anti-Israel kind of view that has been imbued in most of the Middle Eastern Studies programs. So tackling the academic problem, I think, is not nearly as easy as tackling, the American military problem, where people are very sympathetic within the military, and the more higher up they are within the military, and the more they know about the strategic benefit to the United States of Israel, of having somebody right there in the Middle East that has their finger on the pulse of, radical Islam and how they can attack Western capitals, the more sympathetic they become to the state of Israel. But the academic issue is a huge problem, and I think we're going to have to save that for a whole other webinar. Anyway, Sarah Leah, are there any other questions?
No, at this time they've all been answered.
All right. Well, I cannot thank Michael Makowski enough. I think this is a critically important issue, and you have converted me as somebody who was incredibly skeptical about this originally. Both you and our brilliant Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, have both convinced me that this would be not only in Israel's self-interest, but in America's self-interest. So if any of you listening have time to write to the president about this and to write to your senators about this, I think you can use your time of self-quarantine and self-isolation to do something good for both of our nations. Anyway, thank you so much, Michael.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and wish everybody good health. And
thank you.
Safe.
Thank you. Stay safe. Thank you.